Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're cracking open a genuinely fascinating piece of source material.
We really are, yeah.
We've got our hands on this wonderfully detailed recording of a university psychology lecture. And it's specifically focused on cognitive social approaches to human behavior.
Right, and the mission for us today is, well, it's really to unpack a massive fundamental shift in how science understands what makes you and everyone around you tick.
Exactly, because for a very long time, the prevailing scientific view was that human beings were basically just programmable robots. We were seen as organisms that just blindly responded to our environments. But today, we're diving into the messy, complex, and incredibly powerful world of human thought, social learning, and the whole cognitive revolution.
And if you look at the background I've set up for us today, you'll actually see a visual representation of that exact journey.
Oh, wow, yeah.
Yeah, so on one side, we have the stark, highly controlled environment of a classic mid-century psychology, cages, levers, bright lights.
Right, very clinical.
Very. But as we move across the screen, that rigid lab fades into this glowing, abstract, highly complex network of neural pathways.
Like that.
And what's fascinating here is why this transition isn't just some historical footnote. Understanding these models of the mind, how we moved from that stark lab to the glowing neural network, is essentially the ultimate life hack for you listening right now.
It really is.
Because when you understand these cognitive social approaches, you gain the vocabulary and the tools to recognize exactly why you do what you do, how you actually learn from the world around you, and the actual mechanics of how you can change your own behavior.
It's a profound shift. And the journey we're taking you on today covers some pretty wild territory.
Definitely.
We're going to look at how shock dogs gave us the blueprint for understanding human depression. We're going to look at rebellious rats running mazes.
Rebellious rats are my favorite.
They're great. And how Stanford undergrads transformed into sadistic prison guards in just a matter of days. We are even going to prove to you that you have multiple memory systems just by asking you to think about the smell of bacon.
That's a fun one.
Yeah, but let's start with where psychology was before this whole cognitive revolution happened. We have to look at that stark lab on your background, which represents behaviorism, particularly as it was championed by B.F. Skinner.
Right.
The source lecture lays out the Skinnerian worldview, and it's a pretty extreme premise to wrap your head around.
It is.
The fundamental idea was that the laws of learning apply equally to humans and animals.
That's right. Skinner's approach was completely grounded in the idea that if you want psychology to be a hard science, like physics or chemistry, you have to observe what is strictly measurable.
And you can't measure a thought.
Exactly. You can't put a thought on a scale. And the most radical implication of his approach is what became known as the black box concept of the mind.
The black box.
Yeah. Skinner argued that we don't need to look at consciousness at all. We don't need to look at your wishes, your internal beliefs, your complex mental life, or your dreams.
They just don't matter to a behaviorist.
Right. From a purely behaviorist perspective, the mind is a black box. You can't see inside it. And crucially, Skinner argued that you don't even need to see inside it to understand why someone does something.
So what do you need?
All you need are two pieces of observable data: what happens in the environment and what the organism does in response. If certain environmental events reliably predict certain behavioral responses, that is literally all the data you need to develop universal laws of learning.
It's a pretty bleak worldview, though, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, if we accept Skinner's premise, does that mean our entire concept of free will is just an illusion?
According to him, yes.
The source lecture points this out very clearly. If our behaviors are entirely controlled by contingencies and reinforcements in the environment, there's no such thing as autonomy.
Exactly. From a strict behaviorist standpoint, autonomy is a myth we tell ourselves to feel better. The lecturer gives a highly relatable example to illustrate this. So think about your career. You might think you're making a completely free, autonomous choice to go into a particular profession. Say, you decide to become an accountant instead of an artist.
Right. You feel like you weighed the pros and cons and made a rational, internal decision.
But a behaviorist would say, is it really a free choice? Or is it mandated by market forces suggesting there are no jobs in your passion, so you go where the money is?
The environment rewarding you with a paycheck.
Precisely.
Yeah.
Or perhaps it's mandated by a government telling you to go into a specific field, or even just parental approval acting as a social reward. Either way, your actions are being dictated by external rewards and punishments. You are just responding to the environment's pressure.
Which raises some pretty massive questions about everything from our justice system to our moral codes, all of which, they rely heavily on the idea that we choose our actions.
Oh, absolutely.
But as the lecturer notes, you kind of have to admire Skinner's intellectual commitment.
You do.
He took his assumptions, he tested them rigorously, and he was completely willing to think the unthinkable. Building a career arguing that human freedom is a myth takes a certain kind of relentless dedication.
It really does. And the lecturer actually couldn't resist a bit of dark humor regarding Skinner, who had passed away relatively recently at the time the lecture was recorded.
Yeah, I caught that.
He quipped, "May he rest in his Skinner box."
Which is brutally funny.
Yeah.
But as dominant as this behaviorist view was, and I mean, it ruled psychology for decades, cracks inevitably started to show in the foundation.
They always do.
Anomalies began to arise in the literature that this black box theory simply could not explain. And the most glaring anomaly mentioned in the source involves some highly rebellious rats in the 1930s and 40s.
Yes, Edward Tolman's work.
Right. A psychologist named Edward Tolman was studying something called latent learning.
This is a pivotal moment in the history of psychology because it challenged the very core of behaviorism. Tolman set up an experiment where he placed a group of rats in a maze and just let them run around.
Just exploring.
Just exploring. Crucially, they weren't given any food. They weren't being reinforced or conditioned in any way. In strict behaviorist terminology, they were just emitting random operants.
Okay, let's pause on that term for a second because it's pretty heavy jargon.
Mm-hmm.
When we say they were emitting random operants, what does that actually look like for the rat in the maze?
Good question. So in Skinnerian terms, an operant is just a behavior that operates on the environment. So emitting random operants just means the rats were wandering around aimlessly.
Sniffing a corner.
Sniffing a corner, scratching a wall, turning left, turning right. There's no goal, and because there's no food reward, behaviorism dictates that absolutely no learning is taking place.
Right, because there's no reinforcement.
Exactly. Meanwhile, Tolman had a second group of rats in an identical maze, and these rats were being conditioned. Every time they ran the maze and reached the end, they found food. Naturally, through reinforcement, these conditioned rats learned to navigate the maze quickly and efficiently.
But then Tolman does something brilliant. He takes that first group of unreinforced wandering rats, and suddenly he puts food at the end of their maze.
Right.
And according to pure behaviorism, these rats should have to start from scratch. They haven't been rewarded, so they haven't learned the maze. They should just stumble around until they accidentally find the food and slowly learn the path over many trials.
But what actually happens?
The very second the food is introduced, those rats run the maze almost perfectly. They run it just as fast as the rats who had been conditioned the entire time.
And the implication of that finding is massive. It proved that those unreinforced rats were actively forming what Tolman called cognitive maps in their minds while they were just wandering around.
They were building a map without a reward.
Yes. They were mapping the territory, understanding the spatial layout without any reward whatsoever. Learning was happening silently in the background, latent learning.
And behaviorism just couldn't explain that.
Behaviorism simply could not account for this. If there's no reinforcement, no learning should occur. Yet, there it was. It proved unequivocally that you have to look inside the black box. The organism isn't just reacting. It is thinking, organizing, and mapping.
It's the moment the black box gets blown wide open. And what allowed the cognitive view to eventually become the dominant paradigm wasn't just rat experiments. It was a massive technological leap happening in the broader world. The invention of the computer.
Yes, the timing was perfect.
The source details how post-World War II computer technology provided a brand new, highly effective metaphor for the human mind.
It completely shifted the vocabulary of psychology. Instead of a black box where stimuli go in and responses come out, human beings were suddenly conceptualized as information processing systems.
Like a literal computer.
Exactly. The computer model suggests a flow. We take input from the outside world, we bring it into a central processing unit, we transform it, we store it in memory, we retrieve it into a mental workspace, we run operations on it, and then we generate an output.
Output being our behavior.
Right. This metaphor gave psychologists a robust framework to model psychological processes. They finally had a way to talk about what was happening between the stimulus and the response.
Okay, so if our brains are constantly buffering, processing, and outputting all this input, it begs the question of who or what is actually steering the ship.
The driver.
Right. The cognitive social theory argues that mediating between the environment and your behavior are your thoughts, your cognitions. And that brings up the work of Julian Rotter, one of the first theorists to seriously explore how cognition mediates our actions.
And the source actually has a funny little aside about him because his last name is spelled Rotter, which looks exactly like Rotter.
Yeah, the lecturer notes that for entirely understandable reasons, he chose to pronounce it Rotor.
He likely had German heritage where the pronunciation would naturally sound closer to Rotor anyway, but the lecturer jokes that since he calls himself Rotor, we will grant him that dignity.
We will grant him that. So Julian Rotter developed a crucial concept called expectancies. An expectancy is, at its core, an expectation about the future, but his argument was revolutionary for the time.
How so?
He stated that an animal or a human will behave not on the basis of how they have objectively been conditioned by the environment, but on the basis of how they perceive they have been conditioned.
That is a fundamental distinction. If the environment is rewarding you for a behavior, but you don't actually perceive the connection between your behavior and the reward, you won't change your behavior. Your internal perception overrides the external reality.
Exactly.
Rotter was particularly interested in a very specific overarching kind of expectancy called the locus of control. This is your internal expectation regarding who or what is actually in charge of your life's outcomes. Are you in the driver's seat or are you just a passenger?
And to measure this, Rotter developed a specific questionnaire designed for humans. He designed it using forced choice items.
Which is a brilliant psychological tool because it forces you to take a stand. You are given two statements, A and B. Even if you think the nuanced truth lies somewhere in between the two, you are forced to choose which side you lean toward more strongly.
I want to spend some time on this because it's a fantastic lens to view your own worldview through.
Yeah.
I'm going to read these specific forced choice scenarios directly from the source material. You, listening right now, try to guess which option you would pick if you were forced to choose.
Play along.
Here's the first one. Option A, promotions are earned through persistent hard work. Or option B, making a lot of money is largely a matter of getting the right breaks. Which one feels more true to you?
Notice how stark that choice is. It pits entirely internal effort against entirely external luck.
Right. Here's the second one, which the lecturer notes is highly relevant for college students. Option A, in my experience, I've noticed that there's usually a direct connection between how hard I study and the grades I get. Or option B, many times the reactions of teachers seem haphazard to me.
That's a classic one.
Let's do a third one, moving from school to personal relationships. Option A, the number of divorces indicates that more and more people are not trying to make their marriages work. Or option B, marriage is largely a gamble.
That one usually causes some hesitation. It asks you to define the failure of a massive life commitment as either a failure of personal effort or a failure of chaotic variables outside your control.
And the final one from the lecture. Option A, when I am right, I can convince others. Or option B, it is silly to think that one can really change another person's basic attitudes. So let's break this down. What do these choices reveal about the machinery inside our minds?
If you found yourself consistently choosing the A options, believing that promotions are tied to hard work, grades are linked to studying, divorce is a lack of effort, and your arguments can change minds, you exhibit what Rotter defined as an internal locus of control.
Internal.
Yes, you have an expectancy that the causes of the effects in your life are internal to you. You believe you steer your own ship.
And the other side.
Conversely, if you gravitated toward the B options, money is about breaks, teachers are haphazard, marriage is a gamble, and people's attitudes are fixed, you have an external locus of control. You expect that forces outside of yourself, whether it's luck, fate, or powerful other people, dictate your life's path.
It's incredible how a few simple questions can expose the scaffolding of our worldview. But the Force makes a point to note that these expectancies aren't just broad generalized philosophies.
Right, they can be situational.
Exactly. We hold very specific expectancies tied to distinct situations. You might have a generally internal locus of control. You run a business, you take charge of your health. But in one very specific context, maybe your dating life, you have a rigid expectancy that you're completely helpless and external forces are working against you.
And that concept of perceived helplessness transitions us into some of the most profound and frankly difficult research discussed in this entire deep dive. It's the theory of learned helplessness.
Yeah, this is a heavy one.
It originates from highly influential animal research that sought to understand the mechanics of clinical depression.
The researcher who pioneered this was Martin Seligman at the University of Pennsylvania. The setup of his experiment is tough to hear, but it's foundational to modern psychology.
It is.
Seligman took dogs and placed them on the bottom of a metal cage. He then electrified the floor of the cage, subjecting the dogs to uncontrollable aversive stimulation electric shocks. The critical factor here is the word uncontrollable. There was absolutely no behavior the dog could perform to turn off the shock or escape the cage.
The initial reaction of the dogs is entirely predictable. They react with panic, they bark, they run from side to side, they frantically search for a way to escape the pain. This is the natural biological drive for self-preservation.
Right.
But because the environment has been rigged so that no action yields a result, a chilling behavioral shift occurs. Before long, the dogs stop trying.
They just give up.
They sink to the bottom of the cage. They whimper. If you hook them up to monitors and measure their physiological state, they exhibit the identical biological markers of severe human depression. They look mopey, lethargic, and entirely helpless.
But the true tragedy and the scientific weight of this experiment reveals itself in the second phase. Seligman alters the setup. He changes the environment so that escape is now incredibly easy.
He opens a door.
He opens a door, creating a clear path for the dogs to simply hop out of the electrified cage and into a safe, comfortable area right next to it. But what happens when the shocks are turned back on?
The dogs don't jump.
They don't jump. They don't even look for the door. They just sit on the electrified floor and take the pain. They have acquired learned helplessness. Their previous experience of uncontrollability taught them an expectancy nothing I do matters. And that expectancy is so powerful it blinds them to the reality of the open door.
When Seligman observed this, the analogy to human suffering was immediate and striking. When you speak to individuals suffering from severe clinical depression, their cognitive framework often sounds exactly like the psychological equivalent of those dogs.
That's so sad.
They express profound hopelessness, they will articulate that things are terrible, and critically, that there is no possible action they can take to alter their trajectory. Seligman posited that depressed individuals have often learned to be helpless due to past experiences with uncontrollable negative events.
Like a devastating loss, or prolonged abuse, or systemic failure.
Exactly.
And it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, doesn't it?
Yeah.
The learned helplessness essentially paralyzes them. Because they expect failure, they stop trying to escape the situations that cause their pain, and they fail to recognize the open doors, the opportunities, the therapies, the relationships that could actually help them.
Precisely. The expectancy of failure guarantees the failure. But the theory continued to evolve. Seligman, working with colleagues including Chris Peterson, whom the lecturer mentions as being at Michigan at the time, elaborated on this behavioral model to create a more sophisticated cognitive framework called explanatory style.
Explanatory style.
Yes. This model examines the specific ways we make sense of the bad things that happen to us, and they identified a specific formula that characterizes a pessimistic or depressive explanatory style.
Let's walk through that formula because it is incredibly useful for self-reflection. When a negative event occurs, a person with a pessimistic explanatory style will make three specific types of attributions.
Right.
First, they make an internal attribution. The problem isn't the environment, it is entirely their fault. Second, they make a global attribution. The failure isn't isolated to this one specific task. It means they are fundamentally incompetent in everything. And third, they make a stable attribution. This failure isn't a temporary setback. It represents a permanent state of affairs that will last forever.
The lecturer provides a highly relatable, everyday example to bring this formula to life. Imagine you are working a retail or sales job. Your manager asks you to push a few extra items today, and you completely strike out. You make 0 extra sales.
It happens to everyone.
It does. If you have an optimistic or an external explanatory style, you process this failure constructively. You might say, the foot traffic was terrible today, or the customers just weren't in a buying mood, or even, I'm not the best at sales, but I'm great at inventory, so it's fine.
But let's look at what happens if you process that exact same event through the pessimistic formula. Internal, global, stable. Your internal monologue turns incredibly toxic.
It really does.
You say, I didn't make the sale because I am a profoundly flawed, terrible employee. That's internal. In fact, I'm just an incompetent person in general, and everyone is going to realize I'm a fraud in every area of my life. That's global. I have always been a failure, and I'm always going to be a failure. Nothing will ever change. That's stable.
You take one slow afternoon in sales and weave it into a permanent indictment of your entire existence.
And we have to ask, what are the downstream consequences of interpreting reality through that toxic lens? The source material reveals that the impact goes far beyond just experiencing a low mood. The way we cognitively frame these events has a massive, empirically measurable influence on our physical biology.
That's the scariest part. Peterson and others conducted research demonstrating that individuals with a pessimistic explanatory style actually suffer from depressed immune system functioning. They contract illnesses more frequently and recover more slowly.
The lecture takes it even further, citing a longitudinal study that tracked people over long periods. They measured individuals' explanatory styles when they were young adults, and then tracked their health outcomes over decades.
And the results were striking.
The findings suggested that a pessimistic style in youth can actually predict higher mortality rates later in life. Now, the lecturer is careful to add nuance here. It's not a perfect one-to-one predictor. Being a pessimist doesn't guarantee an early grave, but it acts as a significant risk factor. The cognitive habit of pessimism appears to literally suppress the physical immune system alongside the psychological state.
It creates a feedback loop of lethargy. If your cognitive schema tells you that you are fundamentally and permanently incompetent, your motivation to engage in healthy behaviors, exercising, seeking medical care, maintaining social ties plummets.
It all just shuts down.
This understanding naturally leads to a therapeutic revelation. If you want to treat this kind of depression, you have to find a way to intervene at the cognitive level. You have to teach the individual to dispute their own internal, global, and stable attributions. You have to change their explanatory style.
Which brings us to the antidote to helplessness, the can-do belief. In the realm of psychology, this is known as self-efficacy, a concept pioneered by another legendary psychologist, Albert Bandura. Where Seligman showed us how beliefs can paralyze us, Bandura showed us how beliefs can mobilize us.
Bandura argued that there is a specific category of expectancy that is the ultimate engine of human behavior change, self-efficacy expectancies. And it is vital to distinguish this from general self-esteem or overarching confidence.
Right, it's not just feeling good about yourself.
Exactly. Self-efficacy is highly specific. It is your belief in your own capability to organize and execute the exact course of action required to manage a prospective situation. Bandura posited that if you're trying to change what someone does, altering their self-efficacy is the most critical lever you can pull.
So how did Bandura actually prove that this internal belief is the driving force? Because you can't just tell someone with a severe phobia to believe in themselves and expect them to be cured.
No, you definitely can't.
Bandura designed a fascinating study involving individuals suffering from severe snake phobias, people whose lives were genuinely disrupted by their terror of snakes. He wanted to cure them, but he also wanted to map exactly when the cure took effect. First, he administered extensive questionnaires assessing their beliefs about their ability to interact with a snake.
Then he utilized a therapeutic procedure known as participant modeling. The therapist doesn't just talk to the patient about snakes, they model the behavior. The therapist handles a live snake right in front of the phobic patient.
In the same room.
In the same room. Gradually, in highly controlled steps, the therapist encourages the patient to approach. First, just stand in the same room, then step closer. Then, perhaps touch the therapist's arm while the therapist holds the snake. Step by step, they work toward the patient handling the snake themselves.
But the crucial data point from Bandura's study wasn't about the physical mechanics of the exposure therapy. He wanted to know what the best predictor was for when a patient would finally bridge the gap and touch the snake.
Was it how many hours they spent in the room?
Was it how many times they watched the therapist do it? No. The absolute best predictor of behavioral change was a cognitive milestone. It was the exact moment the patient wrote down on a piece of paper or verbally affirmed, "I'm ready now to handle that snake. I know I can do it."
It is the precise moment of cognitive shift. The behavior doesn't change until the belief changes. When the patient's self-efficacy crosses a specific threshold, the physical action follows.
That's amazing.
This is a monumental testament to the cognitive social view. Strict behaviorists would say, we don't care what the patient is thinking, we only care about the proximity to the stimulus and the lack of aversive consequences.
It's just the environment.
Right. But the cognitive theorists counter with, no, how the patient construes the environment and critically how they construe their own capabilities in that environment is the ultimate mediator of the action.
It's also worth noting how radically this departs from the traditional psychoanalytic perspective that dominated earlier in the 20th century.
Completely.
If you went to a strict Freudian analyst with a severe snake phobia, they wouldn't bring a snake into the room. They would assume the snake is merely a symbol for a deeper, hidden motive. They would dig into your childhood, exploring repressed conflicts, or viewing the phobia as a manifestation of some unconscious anxiety. perhaps even interpreting the snake through a psychosexual lens.
Which is a very long, very different process.
Bandura and the cognitive theorists essentially discard that entire framework. They argue that the hidden past is far less relevant than how you are consciously interpreting your abilities in the present moment.
It's an incredibly empowering framework because it locates the power of change within your conscious, accessible thoughts. But if our thoughts and beliefs are the control center for our behavior, we need to understand the architecture of that control center.
How does our brain actually manage, store, and retrieve all the information required to form these beliefs?
This brings us to the mechanics of the mind's workspace, specifically our memory systems. The cognitive revolution didn't just give us the computer metaphor, it gave us detailed models of how information flows through our mental hardware.
Let's break down this flow, starting with the fastest and most fleeting system, short-term sensory registration. This is the very first point of contact between your brain and the outside world.
Sensory registration is where raw data from your environment first impacts your sensory receptors. Your brain holds onto this raw data for a microscopic amount of time to decide if it's worth paying attention to. For visual information, this sensory store lasts for only about half a second before it decays completely.
Half a second.
The lecturer in our source actually guides his students through a live, interactive experiment to demonstrate this, and it's something we can replicate right now.
Yes, let's do it. If you are listening to this in a safe place, not driving, let's try this quick experiment. I'm going to snap my fingers. The exact millisecond you hear the snap, I want you to close your eyes as fast as you can. Ready?
Go for it.
Snap. Okay, keep them closed. Did you notice that for just a brief, lingering instant after your eyelids shut, you still had a vivid visual image of the room in front of you? It wasn't a memory yet. It was like a ghost image fading away. You can open your eyes now. That fading flash is your visual sensory registration in action. It is a massive influx of data that your brain instantly dumps if you don't focus on it.
Now, if you do focus your attention on a piece of that sensory data, it moves into the next system, short-term memory. This system is slightly more durable, holding information for about 30 to 45 seconds unless you actively rehearse it by repeating it to yourself.
Like repeating a phone number.
Exactly. But short-term memory has a much more famous limitation than its duration, and that is its capacity limit. A landmark paper in psychology by George Miller dubbed this limit the magic number 7, plus or minus 2.
Miller discovered that the average human cognitive architecture can only hold about 7 distinct pieces of information in short-term memory simultaneously. Some people might tap out at 5, some mental acrobats might juggle 9 or 10, but 7 is the standard human limit. And the lecturer points out a fantastic historical application to this.
The phone numbers.
Have you ever wondered why standard local phone numbers, before the era of mandatory area codes, were exactly 7 digits long? It wasn't arbitrary. The phone companies designed the system around George Miller's psychological research. They knew 7 digits was the maximum a person could comfortably hold in their mind between looking at the phone book and dialing the rotary phone. The lecturer jokes that if AT&T had decided to make local numbers 8 digits long, society would have ground to a halt.
But that raises an obvious paradox. We absolutely do process and remember strings of information far longer than 7 items. We routinely navigate 10-digit phone numbers, complex passwords, and massive strings of data. How does our brain bypass the biological limit of 7?
The answer is a cognitive hack known as chunking. Chunking is brilliant. It involves taking multiple individual pieces of data and binding them together using your existing knowledge to form a single meaningful unit, a chunk.
Right.
Once they are grouped, your short-term memory treats that entire chunk as just one of its 7 available slots. The lecturer gives a great example using his local university phone prefix, which was 764. Because he dialed it every day, 7, 6, and 4 weren't 3 separate numbers taking up 3 slots. They merged into one single concept. This freed up his mental workspace to easily hold the rest of the digits.
There is an even more extreme and deeply fascinating example of chunking detailed in the source literature. In the early 1980s, cognitive psychologists conducted a study with an average undergraduate student. He didn't possess a photographic memory, he was entirely neurotypical, but he happened to be a dedicated long-distance runner. The researchers trained him to use a highly personalized chunking strategy based on his knowledge of running times. He learned to look at random strings of numbers and hierarchically organize them into marathon times, mile split times, and sprint times.
So if he saw the numbers 3, 4, 5, he wouldn't see 3 separate digits. He would see 3 hours and 45 minutes, a solid marathon time, which occupies only one chunk.
Yes.
By building these complex, layered schemas based entirely on his personal expertise, this perfectly average student expanded his short-term memory capacity to hold roughly 80 random numbers at once. It demonstrates that our memory capacity is heavily dependent on our expertise and our ability to organize data.
Exactly. When you look at a chess grandmaster scanning a board, they aren't memorizing the individual coordinates of 32 distinct pieces. Their expertise allows them to chunk the board into 3 or 4 recognizable strategic patterns. Let's demonstrate how powerful this is with another quick interactive test from the lecture. This is a finance memory test.
I am going to read a string of 16 letters. Try to hold them in your short-term memory. Here we go. D, J, S, E, C, N, Y, S, E, W, S, J, A, M, E, X. Okay, that is 16 individual letters. That is more than double the magic number 7. If you try to repeat them back to me right now, it probably feels like a jumbled alphabet soup. Your short-term memory buffer is completely overwhelmed.
But watch what happens when we change the context and apply a chunking schema. The lecturer tells his students to view these letters through the lens of the financial world. Let's look at the exact same sequence of 16 letters, but grouped differently. DJ, SCC, NYSC, WSJ, AMX.
The difference is night and day. It instantly transforms from 16 impossible letters into 5 effortless concepts. Dow Jones, SEC, NYSC, Wall Street Journal, AMX. You've completely bypassed the capacity limit of your short-term memory by using the knowledge already stored in your long-term memory to reorganize the incoming data.
Which serves as a perfect transition into that final system, long-term memory. The source material highlights a crucial evolution in how psychologists view this system. Historically, it was conceptualized as a massive, single filing cabinet where all memories were dumped in the same format.
Just files of data.
Right. But the cognitive view understands long-term memory as a collection of different representational systems. We don't just store abstract data, we store visual representations, auditory loops, motor skills, and sensory experiences.
And this brings us to one of the most memorable moments in the lecture, the joke about the smell of bacon.
It's a great illustration.
The lecturer asks the hall to close their eyes and imagine the smell of bacon cooking. Immediately, everyone can do it. You have a vivid, perfect representation of that scent stored in your long-term memory. But then he challenges them. Now, using only words, describe that smell to me. And the room goes silent. Nobody can do it.
No, you really can't.
You can say it smells smoky or salty, but you cannot linguistically capture the actual essence of the smell. Why? Because the memory of the smell of bacon is not encoded in your brain using language. It is stored strictly as an olfactory, sensory representation.
And as the lecturer dryly notes, it's a memory that is also frequently stored on your hips.
Nice.
Humor aside, the point is profound. We all rely on different representational systems to navigate reality. The lecturer openly shares his own cognitive bias here. He admits that if you were to plot his visual spatial representational skills on a bell curve, he would land squarely in the impaired range. He simply cannot manipulate visual maps in his mind.
Me either, honestly.
If you hand him a drawn map or tell him to go north, he is completely lost. However, his verbal representational system is highly developed. If you give him the exact same route using verbal instructions, turn left at Main Street, turn right at the gas station, he navigates it flawlessly.
This specific anecdote aligns perfectly with the work of developmental psychologist Howard Gardner, who introduced the theory of multiple intelligences. Gardner argued that the traditional concept of a single, overarching IQ that defines how smart you are is fundamentally flawed.
That's too narrow.
Instead, he proposed that humans possess a variety of distinct intelligences, often utilizing different parts of the brain and relying on different representational systems. You might possess off-the-charts verbal intelligence but struggle with mathematical logic. You might be a genius in kinesthetic intelligence, meaning you have extraordinary bodily awareness and motor control, like an elite athlete or a dancer, but have poor musical intelligence.
It drastically expands our understanding of human capability. But regardless of which intelligence or representational system you favor, your brain still faces the monumental task of organizing an infinite amount of long-term data. It does this through the use of schemas. Schemas are organized thought patterns. They are the cognitive templates, the mental shortcuts that we use to rapidly categorize and understand the world without having to process every new situation from scratch.
To illustrate how quickly these templates activate, the lecturer asks the class to define the schema of a professor. What image pops into your head? The students immediately shout out the cultural tropes. They describe an older male, perhaps a bit absent-minded, smoking a pipe, wearing a tweed jacket with elbow patches that clash with his pants, wearing glasses, and ideally being brilliant in his specific field.
Now, the lecturer accurately points out that schemas can be culturally outdated or highly stereotyped. The assumption that a professor defaults to male is a schema that society is actively revising. But the biological purpose of the schema is efficiency. It allows your brain to auto-complete your reality.
Autocomplete, yeah.
When you walk into a classroom and see someone matching that schema at the podium, your brain instantly loads a massive file of expectations regarding how that person will behave, how you should address them, and what the context of the room is, all in a fraction of a second.
Schemas are the brain's ultimate autocorrect feature. But to truly demonstrate the staggering power of a schema to construct your reality, we have one more interactive test. This one is pulled from a classic cognitive psychology study by Bransford and Johnson.
This is wild.
I'm going to read you a paragraph exactly as it appears in the source material. I want you to listen to the words and try to make sense of what is being described. Here we go.
Listen closely.
The procedure is actually quite simple. First, you arrange things into different groups. Of course, one pile may be sufficient depending on how much there is to do. If you have to go somewhere else due to lack of facilities, that is the next step. Otherwise, you are pretty well set. It is important not to overdo things. That is, it is better to do too few things at once than too many. In the short run, this may not seem important, but complications can easily arise. A mistake can be expensive as well. At first, the whole procedure will seem complicated. Soon, however, it will become just another facet of life. It is difficult to foresee any end to the necessity for this task in the immediate future, but then one never can tell. After the procedure is completed, one arranges the materials into different groups again. Then they can be put into their appropriate places. Eventually, they will be used once more, and the whole cycle will have to be repeated. However, that is part of life.
If you are experiencing what the students in the lecture hall experienced, your brain is currently spinning its wheels. The words themselves are simple, the grammar is correct, but the paragraph feels completely devoid of meaning. It sounds like a series of vague, disconnected instructions. Your brain is desperately searching for a framework to attach the information to, and finding nothing, it struggles to comprehend or remember any of it.
But watch what happens when I give you the schema activation keyword. The title of that paragraph is Washing the Clothes.
Ooh.
Now let's look back at those confusing sentences. Arranging things into different groups. You are sorting the lights and the darks. Going somewhere else due to lack of facilities. You are driving to the laundromat. Don't overdo things. Better to do too few than too many. Don't overload the washing machine or it will overflow. Arranging the materials into groups again and putting them in appropriate places. You are folding the laundry and putting it in your dresser drawers. Eventually they will be used once more and the cycle repeats. You wear the clothes, they get dirty, and you wash them again.
It is an incredible cognitive shift. The instant the schema of washing clothes is activated, the text transforms from gibberish into perfect clarity. This experiment proves a foundational principle of the cognitive approach. Memory and comprehension are not passive recordings like a video camera. Memory is an active, constructive process. We use our enduring schemas to fill in the gaps, interpret ambiguous data, and construct the reality we experience.
But the source material is quick to warn us that this constructive process has a very dark, dangerous side. Because our brains rely on schemas to fill in the blanks, our memories can be remarkably fragile and easily manipulated by outside forces.
Very easily manipulated.
The most chilling example of this involves eyewitness testimony in the criminal justice system. Imagine you witness a car accident on a busy street. Months later, you are called to the witness stand. The phrasing the lawyers use can literally alter your memory of the event.
This is based on the groundbreaking work of Elizabeth Loftus. If a prosecutor asks you, at what speed were the cars going when they smashed into each other, your brain accesses a completely different schema than if a defense attorney asks, at what speed were the cars going when they hit each other.
The difference is just one word, but the impact is profound. The word smashed activates a violent, high-impact schema. Studies have shown that simply hearing the word smashed causes eyewitnesses to genuinely reconstruct their memory. They will estimate a significantly higher rate of speed, and shockingly, a week later, they are far more likely to falsely remember seeing broken glass at the scene, even if there was none.
Their schema rewrote the literal memory of the event to fit the word.
Understanding these cognitive processes isn't just academic. It shows us how vulnerable our perception of truth really is.
So we've established that our schemas govern how we interpret the world, and our expectancies govern what we believe is possible. But how do we bridge the gap between interpretation and physical action? How does the cognitive machinery actually decide to do something?
Right, getting from thought to action.
This brings us to a highly detailed 7-step model of decision-making. The source outlines the anatomy of a decision using a scenario that any parent will instantly recognize.
Let's really dig into this scenario because it shows just how fragile human behavior is. The setup is this. You have a teenage son. Historically, he is a good student, and you have a solid relationship. But suddenly, he brings home a report card full of Ds.
Bro.
He has stopped putting in effort, and you have to decide what action to take. The cognitive behavioral model states that you must successfully navigate 7 distinct cognitive gates before any action occurs. Let's walk through them. Step 1 is encoding.
Encoding is how you initially categorize the problem in your mental workspace. How do you construe this report card? Do you encode it internally and globally? I am a terrible parent, I failed him, there's nothing I can do, and sink into helplessness.
That's the Seligman trap.
Exactly. Do you encode it defensively? He's doing this deliberately to attack me and ruin my life, which leads to blind rage. Or do you encode it constructively? My son is engaging in behavior that is detrimental to his future, and as a family, we need to devise a structural solution. How you encode the problem dictates every subsequent step. Let's assume you encode it constructively. You pass gate 1. That brings you to step 2, goal setting.
Goal setting sounds simple, but it requires specificity. Your broad goal is, I want him to do better, but you need a specific, actionable target. The goal becomes, I want him to complete his assignments and raise his grades to Bs by the next semester. Okay, you have a problem and a goal. Step 3 is problem solving. You have to generate a strategy to bridge the gap. You brainstorm, I could ground him, I could hire a tutor, I could take away his video games.
Right, weighing options.
Weigh the options and finally settle on a plan. I'm going to check his homework every single night before he is allowed any free time, and I will implement a reward system if his grades improve. You've solved the conceptual problem.
But conceptual solutions are useless without step 4 requisite skills. All the brilliant problem solving in the world falls apart if you lack the actual tools to execute the plan. Are you capable of being a disciplinarian? When your son pushes back and says, come on, all my friends are online right now, I'll do it later, do you have the assertiveness skills to hold the line?
That's tough.
Furthermore, do you possess the academic skills to actually check his work? The lecturer shares a brilliant, self-deprecating anecdote from his own high school days to illustrate this vulnerability.
I love this story. The lecturer talks about taking Latin in high school. He realized early on that his parents didn't know Latin, which meant they lacked the requisite skills to check his homework.
Yeah.
So he would just fake it. If the vocabulary word was agricola, he would confidently write down agriculture. If the translation phrase was Caesar's famous Veni Vidi Vici, he knew it meant I came, I saw, I conquered. So he would just write something close, like, and I was victorious.
So smart.
When his parents glanced at the paper, it looked like a completed assignment. They didn't have the skills to spot the deception. If you don't actually know geometry or chemistry, your teenager can easily bypass your grand plan.
Exactly. But let's assume you pass gate 4. You are assertive and you happen to be great at high school math. You move to step 5, outcome expectancy. This goes back to Rotter's theories. Do you fundamentally believe that your specific plan checking the homework will actually yield the desired outcome? Better grades.
If you harbor a secret belief that the teacher is biased against your son or that the school system is broken, your outcome expectancy is essentially 0. You will think, why bother fighting with him every night if the teacher's going to fail him anyway? If you lack the outcome expectancy, the behavior stops here.
But let's say you trust the school and you believe checking the homework will work. You arrive at step 6, self-efficacy. We discussed Bandura's concept earlier, and this is where the rubber meets the road. Do you believe that you, personally, can pull this routine off every single night? Do you have the physical and emotional energy, after working an exhausting 9-to-5 job, commuting home, and making dinner, to sit down and wage a battle of wills over algebra?
Right. Do you have the stamina?
If you look at your own schedule and think, I just don't have it in me to be the enforcer every night, your self-efficacy fails and the plan is abandoned.
And finally, even if you navigate all 6 previous hurdles, you encode it right, set a goal, solve the problem, have the skills, expect a good outcome, and believe you can do it. You still have to face step 7, self-regulation. This is the ongoing monitoring of your own behavior. It is week 3 of the plan. You are tired, you let it slide on a Wednesday, then you let it slide on a Thursday. Do you have the self-regulatory mechanisms to catch your own slippage, correct your course, and recommit to the plan? Or do you just let the new habit fade away?
When you lay out the anatomy of a decision like this, encoding, goal setting, problem solving, skills, outcome expectancy, self-efficacy, and self-regulation, it paints a picture of extreme cognitive fragility. If you stumble at literally any of those 7 steps, the intended behavior simply evaporates. It really drives home the lecturer's concluding thought on the matter. Given how many intricate cognitive gates must be perfectly navigated, it is a minor miracle that human beings ever managed to accomplish anything at all.
It is exhausting just mapping it out. But this model assumes we are making decisions in a vacuum, relying solely on our internal processing. The reality is that we are profoundly social creatures. We do not operate in isolation. Our cognitions, our expectancies, and our behaviors are deeply, sometimes terrifyingly, influenced by the environments we inhabit and the people we observe around us. This brings us to the power of situations and social learning.
Let's dive into the situational aspect first, championed by psychologist Walter Mischel. Mischel pushed back against a very entrenched idea in psychology, the concept of broad, enduring personality traits. For decades, psychoanalysts and personality theorists categorized people into rigid types. They might label someone an anal character, a Freudian term for someone whose personality is rigidly defined by a need for excessive order, neatness, and control across their entire life.
Right, the person who alphabetizes their spices.
Mischel looked at the data and argued that this kind of trait-based thinking is fundamentally flawed because it ignores the context. He argued that cross-situational consistency in human behavior is actually remarkably low. Behavior isn't driven by an immutable internal trait. It is tailored to the specific demands of the situation.
So the trait changes depending on where they are.
A person who exhibits highly anal behavior at the office, organizing their desk to the millimeter, making relentless spreadsheets, and snapping if a pen is moved, might go home and live in an apartment that looks like a disaster zone with clothes on the floor and dishes in the sink. If you want to predict how someone will act, Mischel argued, don't look at their personality profile, look closely at the situational cues they are currently reacting to.
And there's perhaps no more famous or more disturbing demonstration of how a situation can entirely overpower individual personality than the Stanford prison experiment. Conducted by social psychologist Philip Zimbardo, this study sought to understand exactly how much influence social roles and environmental situations exert on our behavior. The setup is infamous. Zimbardo recruited a group of Stanford undergraduate students. They were screened to ensure they were completely normal, healthy, well-adjusted young men with no history of psychological issues or violent tendencies.
Zimbardo then randomly assigned these students to play the roles of either guards or prisoners in a simulated prison environment constructed in the basement of the Stanford Psychology Building. They went to great lengths to establish the situational reality. Real local police officers were enlisted to publicly arrest the assigned prisoners at their homes, handcuff them, and bring them to the basement. The guards were given uniforms, mirrored sunglasses to prevent eye contact, and wooden batons.
The plan was to run the simulation for 2 full weeks to observe how the dynamics developed. But the outcome was so rapid and so deeply disturbing that Zimbardo was forced to abruptly cancel the entire experiment after just 6 days. Why? Because the situation swallowed the individuals whole. These normal, well-adjusted college kids were entirely consumed by their assigned roles. The students playing the guards began to exhibit genuinely sadistic behavior, devising cruel psychological punishments and humiliating the prisoners. The students playing the prisoners broke down. They became submissive, intimidated, and began showing signs of severe, acute psychological distress.
The situational matrix, the uniforms, the environment, the power dynamic completely overrode whatever pre-existing personality traits or moral compasses those students possessed. And the most chilling detail from the source material is that Zimbardo himself was not immune to the power of the situation.
He got sucked in, too.
He appointed himself the superintendent of the prison, and he later admitted that he became entirely wrapped up in maintaining the security of his fake prison, losing sight of the ethical boundaries of his own experiment. He had to be jolted out of his role by an outside observer who was horrified by what was happening. It forces us to ask a deeply uncomfortable question. How much of what you consider to be you is actually just an enduring personality, and how much is simply a reflection of the specific situation you happen to be standing in?
It's terrifying to think about. The cognitive social view suggests that under the right situational pressures, we are capable of behaviors we would never consciously endorse. But situational pressure isn't the only way society shapes us. We also learn simply by watching. This brings us back to Albert Bandura and his groundbreaking work on observational learning. The strict behaviorist view held that learning only occurs through The setup here is classic. A Bobo doll is one of those large inflatable toys that has a heavy weight at the bottom. If you punch it, it falls over and immediately pops back up. Bandura brought young children into a playroom and had them observe an adult interacting with this doll. He created different experimental conditions. In one, the adult model played nicely with the toys and ignored the doll. In another, the adult was completely passive. But in the critical condition, the adult model acted violently toward the Bobo doll. The child watched as the adult punched the doll, slammed it against the floor, struck it with a mallet, and kicked it around the room.
After observing the adult, the child was then allowed to play in the room alone. The results were stark and undeniable. There was a massive correlation between the modeled behavior and the child's subsequent actions. The children who had witnessed the aggressive adult were highly likely to approach the Bobo doll and mimic the exact aggressive behaviors they had seen. They punched it, hit it with the mallet, and aggressively threw it down.
The implications of this are staggering, particularly for how we raise children. The lecturer points out a deeply ironic consequence of observational learning regarding discipline. For generations, a common method of disciplining a child who hits their sibling is to spank or physically punish the child. The parent's intent is to use behavioral punishment to extinguish the hitting behavior. But through the lens of Bandura's observational learning, what is actually happening? The parent is literally modeling the exact use of severe physical aggression to solve an interpersonal problem. They're teaching the child, via demonstration, that when you are frustrated with someone smaller than you, physical force is the appropriate response.
It completely undermines the intended lesson. The lecturer drives this point home with a wonderfully absurd joke about a farmer. This farmer is determined to teach his pet pigeon how to talk. Specifically, he wants the pigeon to say the word uncle. He tries everything, and finally he resorts to strict behavioral punishment. Every time he says, say uncle, and the pigeon just coos, the farmer swats the bird with a stick. He tries this over and over, but the pigeon never speaks. Frustrated, the farmer gives up, throws the pigeon into the chicken coop, and storms off. An hour later, he hears an absolute uproar coming from the coop. He runs back, looks inside, and what does he see? The pigeon is holding a stick in its beak, furiously beating the chickens, yelling, say uncle, say uncle.
It's a great joke, and it perfectly encapsulates the flaw in physical punishment. The pigeon didn't learn the vocalization the farmer wanted. It modeled the aggressive behavior the farmer demonstrated. Now, Bandura makes a vital nuance here. He distinguishes between learning the competence to perform a behavior and having the motivation to actually do it. Just because you learn how to do something doesn't mean you will.
This is a crucial distinction. The lecturer uses the example of media consumption. If you watch a violent film like Silence of the Lambs, you are observing models perform highly specific, horrific actions. Through observational learning, you might actually acquire the cognitive competence, the knowledge of the methods of how one might commit a crime or dispose of evidence. You have learned the how. But the vast majority of people do not walk out of the theater and become serial killers. They possess the competence, but they lack the motivation.
So where does the motivation come from? According to the theory, motivation is heavily driven by vicarious conditioning. This occurs when you don't just watch a model perform an action. You watch the model experience the consequences of that action. The source details a fascinating study involving children watching a film about two adults named Rocky and Johnny. And yes, the lecturer makes sure to clarify this study predates the Sylvester Stallone movies. In the film, Rocky acts as an aggressive bully. He attacks Johnny, steals all of his toys, stuffs them into a sack, and struts off singing a triumphant song, hi-ho, it's off to play I go. In this condition, Rocky is highly rewarded for his aggression. He gets all the toys and faces no consequences.
In a second condition, the children watch a slightly different ending. Rocky tries his aggressive theft, but Johnny fights back, overpowers Rocky, and Rocky is severely punished. He loses the fight and doesn't get the toys. The researchers then place the children in a playroom full of toys. The children who watched Rocky get punished showed very little aggressive behavior. They had learned vicariously that aggression leads to negative outcomes. But the children who watched Rocky get rewarded. They immediately began mimicking Rocky's aggressive theft, taking toys from other kids. They had vicariously learned that bullying pays off.
The detail from this study that absolutely blows my mind involves the ambivalence of the children. Remember, these were preschool-age kids who had already been socialized with basic moral rules. They knew that hitting and stealing were bad. One little girl in the study perfectly highlighted the tension between morality and vicarious reward. She was clearly conflicted. She told the experimenter that she knew what Rocky did was wrong, and she explicitly stated that she didn't like Rocky because he was bad.
And yet, despite her internal moral compass clearly registering the action as wrong, the vicarious observation of Rocky's reward was so overwhelmingly powerful that she turned to the experimenter and asked, "Do you have a sack?"
Do you have a sack? It's chilling. The vicarious reward completely short-circuited her morality. It proves that we are highly susceptible to modeling the behaviors of those we see succeeding, regardless of our own internal compass. So bringing all this together, knowing how our expectancies trap us, how our schemas warp our memories, how fragile our decision-making is, and how easily we model the environment. How do psychologists actually use this knowledge to help people when their mental machinery breaks down? This brings us to Section 9, looking at how we can rewire the mind through psychotherapy.
The source material opens this discussion with a very stern warning for therapists, which the lecture refers to as the Chinese menu warning. To understand the context, you have to think back to classic mid-century Chinese restaurant takeout menus, where you were instructed to choose one dish from column A and one dish from column B to build a meal. In psychology, therapists are often tempted to use this eclectic approach. They look at all the different theories, psychoanalysis, behaviorism, cognitive therapy, and think, I'll just mix and match whatever seems useful for this patient.
But the lecturer warns that arbitrarily mixing these paradigms can lead to disaster in the clinic. The different theories aren't just different techniques. They represent entirely different philosophies about human nature.
Exactly. The lecturer gives a potent example. Imagine a therapist working with a patient from a psychodynamic perspective. They're digging deep into the patient's past, and they uncover that the patient has massive, unresolved hostility toward authoritarian parents. The patient is deeply sensitive to being controlled. Now, imagine that same therapist suddenly decides to pull a technique from column B, strict behaviorism. They switch their demeanor, become highly directive, and start issuing rigid behavioral commands. You need to do exactly X, Y, and Z this week. What happens? The patient immediately maps their parental hostility onto the therapist. The therapeutic relationship shatters because the therapist mixed contradictory approaches without understanding the structural impact on the patient. Integration must be incredibly thoughtful.
But when behavioral and cognitive strategies are applied purely and correctly, they can achieve things that traditional talk therapy struggles with. Cognitive behavioral approaches don't view a phobia or an inhibition as a symptom of deep subconscious turmoil. They view it as a specific maladaptive learned response. And if it was learned, it can be unlearned. The source provides a detailed walkthrough of exactly how to cure a severe, debilitating phobia using a classical conditioning method called systematic desensitization.
This is a beautiful application of learning theory. Let's walk through how you would use this to cure someone of an intense dog phobia. Systematic desensitization involves 3 distinct steps. Step 1 is building an anxiety hierarchy. The therapist and the patient sit down and collaboratively write out a list of scenarios involving dogs, ranking them from the absolute least anxiety-provoking to the most terrifying.
The bottom of the hierarchy, the easiest step, might be something very remote. For example, imagining looking out a window and seeing a tiny dachshund 100 yards away, securely held on a leash by its owner. The top of the hierarchy, the ultimate fear, would be the physical act of enthusiastically petting a large, unrestrained German Shepherd. You build 10 or 15 steps between those two extremes.
Once the hierarchy is established, you move to step 2, relaxation training. You cannot be relaxed and panicked at the same time. The physiological states are incompatible, so the therapist must teach the patient how to induce a state of deep physical relaxation on command. The method described in the source is progressive muscle relaxation. The therapist guides the patient to systematically tense and then completely release specific muscle groups, the hands, the arms, the shoulders, the core, all the way down to the toes.
They often pair this physical release with guided imagery. The therapist might have the patient visualize a deeply calming scene, like lying on a quiet beach, listening to the gentle rhythm of the waves. Although, as the lecturer humorously points out, it is crucial for the therapist to do their homework first. You don't want to use a beach visualization if the patient also happens to suffer from an intense phobia of the ocean.
Indeed. Once the patient has mastered the ability to enter a state of profound physiological relaxation, you bring the 2 components together for step 3, desensitization through pairing. The patient is in the chair, deeply relaxed, muscles loose, breathing steady. The therapist then asks them to mentally visualize the very bottom item on their hierarchy, the dachshund 100 yards away.
As the patient imagines the dog, the therapist asks, "How are you feeling?" The patient might notice a spike in their heart rate and say, "I'm starting to feel anxious." The absolute second the anxiety appears, the therapist stops the visualization. They say, "Stop picturing the dog. Go back to the beach. Tense your muscles. Release them. Breathe." They guide the patient back down to a baseline of complete relaxation.
Then they try again. Picture the dachshund. This time, because they have practice, the patient might be able to hold the image of the distant dog in their mind while remaining completely physically relaxed. When they can successfully do that, they have conquered the first step. They move up the hierarchy. Okay, now imagine a basset hound 50 yards away. If anxiety spikes, they stop, relax, and repeat.
The mechanics of this are incredible. To use our computer metaphor, you are essentially overwriting a corrupted file in the brain's hard drive. The old file linked the stimulus dogs to the physiological response of panic. By pairing the image of the dog with the physical state of deep relaxation, you are literally neurologically breaking the old connection and writing a new code. Step by step, session by session, you move up the hierarchy until the patient can visualize and eventually physically interact with the German Shepherd without triggering the panic sequence.
It is a highly effective, elegant procedure, but the lecturer, ever the showman, ends the class on a cliffhanger. He teases the students that there is another therapeutic procedure based on classical conditioning. It is called in vivo exposure, and it looks like the complete and total opposite of the gentle, gradual approach of systematic desensitization. He implies it is a much more intense, frightening confrontation with the fear. Unfortunately for us, the recording ends there. He saves the details of in vivo exposure for the beginning of the next lecture, leaving us guessing as to how it works.
It's the ultimate academic cliffhanger. But regardless, what an incredible journey we have been on today. The ground we've covered shifts the entire perspective on what it means to be human. To quickly recap this massive psychological evolution, we started in the bleak, rigidly controlled laboratory of the behaviorists, where your free will was declared a myth and your mind a black box. But Tolman's rebellious rats mapping their mazes without rewards, alongside the invention of the computer, blew that box wide open, proving that our internal thoughts are the true mediators of our actions.
We examined the architecture of those thoughts. We learned about Rotter's locus of control, challenging you to ask whether you steer your own life or simply ride the currents of fate. We stared into the darkness of Seligman's shocked dogs, realizing that helplessness is learned, and we saw the stark reality that a pessimistic explanatory style can literally suppress your immune system and shorten your lifespan.
But we also found the cure in Bandura's self-efficacy, proving that the specific cognitive belief that you can handle the snake is the necessary catalyst for actually doing it. We tested the limits of our own hardware, experiencing the sensory flash of a finger snap, expanding our short-term limits by chunking the stock market, and realizing why we can all vividly imagine the smell of bacon, but none of us can articulate it. We saw how schemas allow us to instantly make sense of washing clothes, but also how they can maliciously rewrite our memories of a car crash in a courtroom.
We mapped the exhausting, fragile, seven-step anatomy of a parent simply trying to check a teenager's homework, highlighting how easily our intentions derail. And finally, we witnessed the terrifying power of situations to override morality in the Stanford prison experiment, and how easily a little girl will abandon her ethics to ask for a sack of stolen toys if she sees a model being rewarded.
The overarching theme of this entire deep dive is simple but profoundly empowering. You are not a black box. You are not a programmable robot. Your conscious thoughts, your deeply held schemas, your expectancies of the future, and the specific environments you navigate are all dynamically intertwined to create the reality you experience and the actions you take. But before we sign off, we want to leave you with one final provocative thought to mull over. Something that builds on the foundation of everything we've discussed today, but brings it directly into the modern hyper-connected era you live in right now.
If we accept the premise that our memories are largely constructive schemas, and if our behaviors are heavily dictated by the specific situations we are placed in, as Michel and Zimbardo demonstrated, what happens to our fundamental sense of self in the digital age? Think about the device in your pocket. The digital environments you inhabit and the social situations you are placed in online are no longer random. They are carefully, algorithmically curated by massive tech platforms designed to maximize your engagement. Are you freely choosing your digital actions? Or are you simply observing and modeling behaviors from millions of digital Rockies influencers and outreach peddlers who are being massively rewarded with likes, views, and viral fame while you vicariously learn and adopt their aggressive or consumerist behaviors? Take a moment today to look at your screen and ask yourself, is your current behavior the exact thing you are swiping on, arguing about, or buying right now stemming from your own internal locus of control? Or is the algorithm acting as your invisible, highly personalized Skinner box, conditioning your expectancies without you even realizing it?
That is a thought that will absolutely keep you up at night and perhaps change how you interact with your phone tomorrow. Thank you so much to you, the listener, for joining us on this deep dive. We explored an incredible amount of the human mind today, and I hope it provided you with a new, powerful lens to view your own internal machinery. Keep questioning the why behind your everyday actions. Actively challenge those negative internal monologues. And remember that by changing your expectancies, you have the power to change your narrative. Until next time, stay curious.